Hey everyone, how's your day going? Whether it's been good or rough, you're not alone. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the world of mystery together. I always enjoyed getting away from the city. The noise, the deadlines, the constant buzzing of life, it was exhausting. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, I could breathe. I could think. This wasn't my first solo camping trip. I had done this a handful of times before, usually finding some remote, off-grid location, setting up camp, and spending a few nights away from civilization. No distractions. Just me, my camera, and the stillness of nature. That was the plan this time, too. I had driven nearly 4 hours from Denver, following a network of dirt roads that eventually led me to a secluded clearing deep in the Pike National Forest. No tourists, no hikers, just endless trees and open sky. The kind of place where you wouldn't hear a single human voice for miles. Perfect. I pulled my Jeep to a stop near a small, slow-moving creek, stepping out and stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds preparing for nightfall. I grabbed my gear from the back, tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, and began setting up. It didn't take long. Years of doing this had made me efficient. Within 30 minutes, my tent was pitched, a small fire crackled in the pit, and a pot of water was heating for coffee. I pulled out my camera, snapping a few shots of the setting sun through the trees. The golden light filtering through the branches was breathtaking. If only I had known what was watching me at that moment. Nightfall came quickly. Out in the wilderness, there were no streetlights, no distant city glow, just the absolute blackness of night stretching endlessly in every direction. I sat by the fire, sipping my coffee, enjoying the way the flames flickered and danced. I was completely alone, but I wasn't afraid. Not yet. Then I noticed something. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Anyone who's spent enough time in the woods knows that even at night, there's always some level of noise. Crickets. The occasional hoot of an owl. The rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. But now? Nothing. Just the soft crackle of my fire and the distant sound of the creek. I frowned, setting my mug down. It was strange, sure, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe a predator was nearby, a fox or a coyote, something that made the smaller creatures go still. I tried to shake the feeling off, but a small, nagging thought crept into my mind. I wasn't alone. I turned, shining my flashlight across the tree line. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick trunks of pines and scattered undergrowth. Nothing moved. I exhaled, forcing a chuckle. Get a grip, man. Still, I couldn't shake the unease settling deep in my gut. It started around midnight. I was sitting inside my tent, flipping through the pictures I had taken earlier in the day when I heard it. A voice. Low. Muted. Distant. A slow, rhythmic chanting. I froze, my fingers tightening around my camera. The sound was faint, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. But it was there. I turned off my flashlight, sitting in complete darkness, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. It was impossible to tell. The sound seemed to shift, coming from one side of the forest, then another, like it was circling my camp. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my pocket knife from my bag and inched toward the tent's entrance, pressing my ear against the fabric. The chanting continued, but the words were unintelligible, a strange, guttural language I didn't recognize. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to stay inside, to ignore it. But I had to look. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. I shined my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. The chanting had stopped. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't on any of my past trips. Fear. Not the rational fear of a bear or a mountain lion, but something deeper. Something unnatural. I stepped out of the tent, standing still, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, somewhere in the darkness, a twig snapped. Snap. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence. I stood frozen, my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing between the trees. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. I wasn't alone. I scanned the forest, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Nothing moved. No shifting shadows, no glowing eyes reflecting back at me. But I knew I could feel it. Someone or something was out there, watching. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Probably just an animal, I muttered under my breath, though I didn't believe it. I had been in the woods enough times to know the difference between the cautious rustling of a deer and the deliberate, unnatural silence of something that didn't want to be seen. A few more agonizing seconds passed. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the sound disappeared. The night was still again. Too still. I let out a slow, shaky breath and backed toward my tent. My mind screamed at me to keep scanning the trees, to make sure nothing was creeping closer. But there was nothing. And somehow that was worse. Back inside my tent, I zipped the entrance shut and sat down on my sleeping bag, gripping the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. I was being paranoid, right? But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the feeling wouldn't go away. I lay down, eyes fixed on the fabric ceiling of my tent, listening. Every creak, every shifting leaf sent a spike of adrenaline through me. Then, just as I started to think I might be able to sleep, tap! My entire body went rigid. A single, deliberate tap on the outside of my tent. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around the handle of my knife. Another tap, then another. Not random. Not the wind. Something was touching my tent. I forced myself to stay still. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to bolt, to grab my keys and get the hell out of there. But I didn't. I waited. Listened. Nothing. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling over the screen as I pulled up the time. 2:57 a.m. Then, a shadow moved. I saw it clearly against the thin fabric of my tent, a human-shaped silhouette standing just outside. I stopped breathing. My fingers hovered over my phone screen, debating whether to dial 911. But then, the figure crouched down and I realized with cold, sinking horror that it was trying to peer inside. I didn't think. I just moved. I lunged forward, slamming my fist against the tent wall. Silence. The shadow froze. For one breathless moment, neither of us moved. Then the footsteps started. Slow. Measured. Moving away from the tent, crunching over the dried leaves. I waited, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Nothing. I stayed awake until the sun came up. At first light, I unzipped the tent cautiously, stepping outside with my knife still clutched in my hand. The fire had burned out completely, leaving nothing but blackened embers and a thin trail of smoke. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the ground around my campsite. And then I saw them. Footprints. Human. Barefoot. Leading directly up to my tent. But here's the part that made my stomach drop: they didn't lead away. Whoever had been standing outside my tent had walked up but never walked back. I swallowed hard, a fresh wave of unease washing over me. The only explanation was that they had stepped backward into the trees, deliberately covering their exit. Which meant they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. I packed my gear in record time. I didn't bother making breakfast. Didn't sit and enjoy my coffee like I usually would. I needed to leave. Now. I threw my bag into the back of the truck and slid behind the wheel, locking the doors as I fired up the engine. As the Jeep rumbled to life, I took one last look at my campsite through the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. Deep in the tree line, barely visible between the branches. A figure. Standing perfectly still. Watching me. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into drive and sped the hell out of there. But even now, long after I made it back to civilization, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever that was, it let me go. And I don't know why. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The moment I saw that figure standing at the edge of the clearing, something inside me screamed to keep going, to get the hell out of there and never return. So I drove. The dirt road twisted and turned through the trees, just like it had on my way in, but this time it felt different. Wrong. The air was heavier. The sunlight, though barely rising, seemed weaker, as if something was draining it before it could reach the forest floor. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. Just a few more miles, I told myself. Then I'd hit the highway. Then I'd be safe. But as I kept driving, a terrible realization started creeping into my mind. The road wasn't ending. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 7:13 a.m. I had been driving for at least 20 minutes, but I hadn't seen a single break in the tree line. No trail markers. No road signs. Just the same endless stretch of forest pressing in from both sides. I shook my head, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. No, that wasn't possible. I knew this road. I had driven it on the way in. It had taken me 10 minutes at most to reach my campsite from the highway. So why was I still here? I pressed harder on the gas, the truck rumbling as it picked up speed. The trees blurred past. I kept my eyes locked on the road, watching for any sign of an exit. Then my stomach dropped. Up ahead on the right side of the road, My campsite. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded slightly, dust kicking up around the tires. My breathing was ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. No. This wasn't happening. But there it was, the fire pit, the flattened patch of grass where my tent had been, the same damn clearing I had just escaped from. My hands trembled as I threw the truck into reverse, backing up so fast the tires nearly lost traction. I spun the wheel, turning onto a narrower side road that I swore I hadn't seen before. I didn't care where it led. I just needed to get out. For the next 10 minutes, I drove without stopping. The road was rougher here, the branches clawing at the sides of my truck as if trying to drag me back. But I didn't slow down. Then, out of the corner of my eye, a movement. I glanced at my rearview mirror. My chest seized. There, sitting in the back seat of my truck. A figure. Not fully formed, more like a shadow. A humanoid shape barely distinguishable against the dark fabric of the seats. But I could feel it. It was watching me. My vision blurred with panic. I gripped the wheel with both hands, trying to keep the truck steady. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing. The back seat was empty. I let out a sharp breath, my hands shaking. Had I imagined it? I swallowed hard, trying to focus. Just keep driving. Just get out of here. But then, a whisper. Right behind me. You're going the wrong way. I nearly veered off the road. My body locked up, my mind screaming in terror. That voice, it wasn't mine. It wasn't my thoughts. I turned, my breath coming out in short, panicked gasps. The back seat was still empty, but the air felt different now. Heavier. Like something was sitting there, just out of sight. I faced forward again, my heart hammering. And then I saw it. Up ahead, standing in the middle of the road. A figure. The same thing I had seen outside my tent. Only this time, it wasn't standing still. It was walking toward me. I floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring. I wasn't stopping. I wasn't slowing down. But as I got closer, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't walking toward me. It wasn't moving at all. The road was. I was getting pulled toward it. Like I was stuck on some invisible treadmill, driving forward but never actually getting anywhere. The figure just stood there, waiting. And I was being delivered to it. My hands clenched the wheel, my mind racing. Think. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I turned the wheel hard, veering off the road and into the trees. Branches slammed against the windshield. The truck bounced violently over uneven ground, but I didn't stop. I kept going. And then, the world tilted. The truck slammed downward, the front end plunging into a ditch. My body lurched forward, the seatbelt snapping tight across my chest. The engine died. Smoke curled from beneath the hood. Everything went silent. For a long moment, I just sat there, shaking, breathing, listening. The forest was still. No footsteps. No whispering voices. Just nothing. I reached for the keys, my hands trembling as I tried to start the engine. Click. Nothing. Click. Click. The truck was dead. My pulse pounded in my skull. I was stuck. Stranded. And as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went numb, I heard it. A tap. Soft. Deliberate. On the driver's side window. My breath hitched. My body refused to turn. The tapping came again. Slow. Rhythmic. Like someone knocking. I squeezed my eyes shut. And then, just beyond the glass, a voice. You're not supposed to leave. Tap. The sound barely registered at first. I was too busy trying to steady my breathing to ignore the burning pain in my chest where the seatbelt had yanked me back on impact. But then it came again. Tap. Tap. Soft. Slow. Deliberate. I swallowed hard, my body refusing to turn. I didn't need to look. I knew where it was coming from. The driver's side window. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the wheel. Every part of me screamed, "Don't look," but the silence was unbearable. Finally, I forced myself to shift my gaze, just enough to see the window out of the corner of my eye. At first, nothing. Just darkness and the vague reflection of my own pale face in the cracked glass. Then, a shape. A handprint appearing slowly, like someone was pressing their palm against the window from the outside. The breath caught in my throat. It wasn't human. The fingers were too long, stretched, unnatural, the tips curling slightly as they dragged down the glass, leaving behind streaks of something dark. Something that wasn't just dirt. My stomach twisted. This was wrong. I had crashed. I had landed nowhere near the road, buried deep in the trees, surrounded by thick underbrush. Nothing should be standing next to my truck. And yet, it was there, waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Think. I had two choices. Stay inside, hope whatever was out there eventually lost interest. Get out. Try to run. Neither option felt like survival. I let out a shaky breath, forcing myself to move. Slowly, I reached down, feeling for the handle of my hunting knife strapped to my belt. The metal was cold against my palm, grounding me. I swallowed hard, then reached for the keys. They weren't there. My blood went cold. My keys had been in the ignition. They had been in the damn ignition. I whipped my head around, frantically scanning the truck's interior. Maybe they had fallen during the crash? Maybe they were somewhere on the floor. Then I saw it. The keys were sitting on the passenger seat, neatly placed, like someone had set them there. A fresh wave of terror slammed into my chest. I hadn't touched them. I hadn't moved them. And that meant someone else had. I forced myself to breathe. Slowly, carefully, I leaned over, extending my hand toward the keys. A sharp creak echoed from the roof of the truck. I froze. Another creak. A shift of weight. Something was on top of the truck. I stayed completely still, my fingers hovering inches from the keys. Then, a slow dragging sound like nails scraping across metal. Moving toward the driver's side door. My heartbeat was a hammer against my ribs. Then, from above, a whisper. Not loud, not a voice exactly. More like a sound mimicking speech. Come back. The words weren't natural. They weren't right. Like someone trying to speak, but not knowing how. I swallowed my fear and grabbed the keys. The scraping on the roof stopped. For a second, everything was completely silent. Then, a hand slammed against the window. I didn't think. I turned the key in the ignition, praying to whatever God was listening. Click, click, click. The engine wouldn't start. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel. Come on, come on. Outside, the presence hadn't moved. I could feel it. Standing there, watching. The truck's interior felt smaller, suffocating. My lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't force myself to breathe. Then, the engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun, kicking up mud and debris, struggling to find traction. Then finally, the truck lurched forward. Branches clawed at the sides as I tore through the underbrush, following no path, no direction. Just away. I didn't care where I ended up. I didn't care if I wrecked again. I just needed to leave. But as I sped through the trees, my headlights cutting through the darkness, I saw something ahead. Something that made my stomach drop into a pit of ice. The road. The same damn road. And standing in the middle of it. The figure. Waiting. Smiling. I hit the brakes, skidding to a stop. My breath came out in sharp, ragged gasps. No, this wasn't possible. I had been driving in the opposite direction. And yet, here I was. Right back where I started. The figure took a step forward. Then another. I couldn't see its face. Not fully. But I knew. Somehow I knew. It had been with me the entire time. Watching. Waiting. Guiding me exactly where it wanted me to go. And now, I had nowhere left to run. Knock. Soft. Slow. Measured. I didn't turn my head. I didn't move. I just stared straight ahead. My breath catching in my throat. The knocking came again. Knock. Knock. A slow rhythm. Not demanding. Not frantic. Just waiting. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. My pulse pounded against my temples. This isn't happening. It had to be my imagination, right? Maybe the crash had rattled me so much that I was hearing things. Then, just outside my window, a whisper. Let me in. My breath hitched. The voice wasn't right. It was flat, almost hollow, like someone repeating words they didn't understand. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind screaming at me to do something. But what? The truck was dead. I was stuck. I reached for my knife, still strapped to my belt. At least I wasn't completely defenseless. But a knife wouldn't help me against this. Then, a sound from the back seat. A slow, deliberate exhale, like someone breathing inside the truck with me. My heart stopped. I turned my head, inch by inch, dreading what I would see. The back seat was empty, but the air felt different, heavy, occupied. And then, just inches from my ear, a whisper. You shouldn't have left. I lunged forward, yanking at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was up. The door wasn't locked, but it wouldn't open. I slammed my shoulder against it, desperate to break free. Nothing. Then all at once, the knocking stopped. The whispers vanished. The forest outside was silent again. But I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. I needed to get out. Sitting there, trapped, wasn't an option. I inhaled sharply, forcing my mind to focus. The truck was totaled, but I wasn't injured. I could still run. But where? If I went back to the road, I'd end up right where I started. I glanced at the tree line. If I could reach higher ground, maybe I could see where the road actually led. It wasn't a great plan, but it was the only plan I had. I gripped my knife and took a deep breath. Then, slowly, I reached for the passenger side door. My fingers curled around the handle, and this time it opened. The night air hit me like a shock to the system. Cold, damp, too quiet. I took a single step outside, my boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The truck sat behind me, a dark, lifeless husk. I turned toward the trees. Then, a voice, right behind me. "Where do you think you're going?" My blood turned to ice. I didn't turn. I didn't stop. I just ran, straight into the dark. I didn't stop running. Didn't dare. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, trees blurring together as my legs burned with exhaustion. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't running toward safety. I was running deeper into its territory. And it wanted me here. Somewhere ahead, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing bathed in eerie moonlight. I staggered into the open, gulping in air, my body trembling. And then, I saw it, standing just at the edge of the trees. Tall, motionless. Its face, if you could call it that, was a twisted mockery of something human. Wrong proportions, a mouth that didn't quite move right, eyes too deep, too dark. But the worst part? It was smiling. Not out of malice. Not out of hunger. But recognition. Like it had been expecting me all along. I took a shaky step back, my mind screaming at me to wake up. To move. To fight. But then it spoke. Not in a whisper. Not in a threat. In my own voice. "You were never supposed to leave." The words sent ice through my veins. It wasn't talking about the forest. It was talking about me. As if I had been here before. As if I had always belonged to it. The realization hit me like a freight train. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me to come back. And now, it had me. I turned and bolted back into the trees. Branches tore at my clothes. My legs screamed in protest. But the forest was different now. The trees shifted, moving, closing in, twisting the path behind me. No matter how far I ran, the clearing always reappeared ahead. The figure always waiting. And then, darkness. Some places, some things are not meant to be understood. There are stories about forests that don't let you leave. Roads that lead nowhere. Voices that aren't your own. Maybe it's just our minds playing tricks on us. Or maybe, just maybe, some places were never meant for us to walk away from. And if you ever find yourself lost, going in circles, or feeling like you're being watched, don't ignore it. Because if you were never supposed to leave, it will make sure you don't.